Back in May, I did a video entitled Legsavingsness, which introduced my concept of how well a shoe saves your legs over the course of a run or a training week. And the first video was focused around foams, because that's the most obvious component when you're talking about how well a shoe treats your legs and feet. But I always intended Legsavingsness to be a series, and this is the next video in that series, and this is around stability, or rather instability. If there's any single keyword that describes 2025 running shoes, I would say that's instability. I don't think I have posted a review this year where the topic of instability has not come up in the comments. As manufacturers all rush to make more dynamic and more responsive foams are getting lighter, they're getting softer, but by doing that, they're getting more unstable, especially as shoes move to higher and higher stacks. So it's one of these balancing acts of everyone wants a more performance-oriented, more bouncy, more resilient foam, but they don't want the trade-offs of instability. And that's why it's been such a hot topic this year. So I thought I'd sit down and go through the categories of stability in running shoes, and let's talk about some examples of shoes that have more or less instability and how these brands are actually trying to engineer and design around some of these problems. And before I begin, two disclaimers. The first one is something I say whenever I'm getting into these very technical topics, is that I'm oversimplifying the idea of stability in a running shoe significantly. There's a lot that goes into this, but I am trying to hit on what I think are the key points and what I look for as a runner and how I judge how stable or unstable a running shoe is. The second is, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a trainer, I'm not a physio. I am not qualified to talk about the biomechanics and how that actually interfaces with stability in a running shoe. I'm only one runner working from my experience of what I've learned over my many years of running. But if you are interested in the real deep end of the biomechanics, I highly recommend to check out the Doctors of Running YouTube channel or their podcast. They're actually doctors, they're qualified to talk about all the biomechanics and how those interface with the shoes. So if you really want to get in the deep end of this stuff and really hear from qualified professionals, definitely check out the Doctors of Running. I'll put a link in the description if you've never been there or know the podcast. Highly recommend them. Let's start by defining the three primary categories of stability in running shoes. Now, these three categories are universal across all brands, and any shoe you're going to go out and buy is going to fall into one of these three categories. And the first one is a neutral running shoe. This is a shoe that allows very natural motion for the foot. It's not trying to control your foot, it's not trying to force it, it just allows your foot to move as naturally as it wants. Second one is a stable neutral shoe. Now, interestingly, stable neutral is a term that I first heard on the Doctors of Running podcast. So again, another plug to go check them out if you don't already know who they are. But a stable neutral shoe will gently guide motion in the foot. It's still fundamentally a neutral shoe, but there's some features designed into it that will just help give a little bit more stability to the overall shoe. And the third is a stable shoe. This is a shoe that will control or even limit motion for the foot. This is that true stability shoe. Now, for the purposes of this video, I'm only going to be really focusing on a neutral or a stable neutral shoe because those are typically the shoes that have instability in them. A stable or stability shoe should never actually have instability built into it. So I'm not going to really focus on those here. However, a few good examples of a good stability shoe would be the Nike Structure 26, the Asics Gel Keanu 32, or the Puma Forever Run Nitro 2. These are shoes that, again, are built to be extremely stable or limit motion in the foot for overpronation, oversupination, anything that really affects the foot. These are really shoes that are meant to control that and stop that. Again, I'm not going to focus on these anymore in this video. So going back to neutral and stable neutral, I think when we're talking about instability in these two types of shoes, there's really two types of instability we're talking about. There's wobbly, which is unstable but still upright, and then there's tippy, which is a shoe that's prone to falling over. I think every type of instability can be described as wobbly or tippy. Secondly, let me go through the three primary things that designers and engineers design into a running shoe to bring stability into the shoe. And I'm going to use the Asics Nova Blast 5 as the example of that because this shoe I think is one of the best stable neutral shoes out there, but it also has the three primary things that I think bring stability into a platform. And the first one is what I call the rails of the midsole or the edges of the outsole. Now, if you know surfboards, you're familiar with the rails of a surfboard. You have a soft rail, a hard rail, even a performance rail. That's how the board will actually cut into the water when you're actually up on the edge of the board. I think there's a very similar concept in running shoes. So the rails, again, are the edges of the midsole or the outside of the outsole. And on the Nova Blast, we have what I would define as a very hard rail. This is a very sharp edge, very squared off. So when you actually land on this shoe, there's a lot of stability brought into that because you have very hard rails. There's no ability for this shoe to roll over. The second thing that I think brings a lot of stability to a shoe is the tooling of the actual midsole itself. And there's two components to this. The first is you can see what I call outriggers on the outsole. You can see there's a lot of foam that sticks out past the edge of the foot on the lateral side and the medial side, and that carries through into the midfoot and into the heel on both sides. That again is bringing stability into this platform. You put those hard square edges of the outsole, the hard rails of this shoe with these outriggers that actually are stabilizing the foot, and that's bringing again a lot of inherent stability into this shoe. The second one in the midsole really is the channeling and in all of these lines that you see built onto the midsole of the shoe. I think a lot of people think that these are just aesthetic, but they're really not. This tooling is really here to help channel the energy that you're putting into the foam and allow the foam in the midsole to compress in very controlled and very specific ways. It's not just aesthetics. And that has a big impact in stability of the shoe. And the third one is what actually called the sidewalls or the bathtub of the midsole, meaning how much of the midsole sticks up above the insole on the shoe. So in the Nova Blast, starting from about the midfoot into the heel, there's a lot of foam that's built up that kind of wraps up around the bottom of the foot and holds the foot into the shoe. Creates what I've called a bucket seat back here, where it's really holding the heel or the midfoot and stabilizing the foot into the shoe. Those three components are something you're going to find on most running shoes, some more than others, and those are the three primary things that bring a lot of stability into a running shoe. Now, as I warned you up front, I'm oversimplifying this a lot. There's a lot more that goes into the geometry of the shoe, the stack of the shoe, the rocker of the shoe. I've made a video previously about rocker, but there's a lot more around geometry. So much more that it's probably going to be its own video in this series further down the road. So stay tuned if you're interested in that. And with all of those definitions out of the way, let's go through a few examples of shoes, and we're going to start with neutral. And the most neutral shoe I can think of in 2025 right now is this, the Puma Velocity Nitro 4. I actually cannot think of a more neutral shoe than this right now. It is a low stack shoe that's in a very soft but resilient foam, very traditional geometry, very little forefoot rocker, and it's extremely flexible. In fact, the only other shoe I could really compare this shoe to would be this, the Adidas Adios 9. However, this isn't a trainer, this is a race flat, and race flats have traditionally been very neutral. This is a very flexible shoe that's very flexible, allows your foot to move very freely, so when you're up on your toes really pushing pace, this shoe completely disappears and gets out of the way. And what's really interesting is this shoe, the Puma Velocity Nitro 4, is very similar to this shoe, the Adios 9, as far as how it feels on your foot. To the point where I think a lot of people would actually find this shoe a bit unstable because there's no guidance whatsoever in this shoe. Again, it's a softer, more resilient foam. It's very flexible. This shoe definitely forces your foot, your ankle, and your lower leg to work so that you actually train in and build that strength and stability into your foot and your leg overall. That's something I definitely want in a trainer, and that's why I actually love this type of neutral shoe for the majority of my running. Now, a lot of the elements I talked about that bring stability into a system, you can see here. You can see the rails of this shoe. I don't think these are that hard of a rail. They're actually a little bit rounded, so they're a little bit of a softer rail, which gives a little bit of a softer initial contact when you're striking in this shoe. But you can see the tooling on the midsole sidewall. There's a ton of channeling in here. This is a midsole that's really designed to really create compaction zones when you're actually landing in the shoe, and it does a wonderful job. Again, it seems like a little subtle detail, but it makes a world of difference. There isn't a lot of sidewalling in this shoe. There isn't a lot of foam that wraps up around the foot. There's a tiny bit in the heel, but overall, because this shoe is so neutral, so flexible, and such a traditional geometry, This is that type of shoe that I think if you want to build more strength into your feet, ankles, and lower legs, spend a lot of time in this type of shoe, and then any other shoe that I'm going to mention in this video isn't going to feel that unstable. Staying in the neutral category, but now definitely moving into the wobbly section, is this, the Adidas Evo SL. I think the keywords most people would associate with this shoe are loose, soft, and unstable. And a lot of the design and engineering details of this shoe contribute to that. This is a very tall stack of a very dynamic race-oriented foam. The foam in this shoe was Adidas's previous primary race foam or super foam, so this is a very dynamic foam that has a lot of bounce and energy return. There's a very high stack of it here. And while the rails of this shoe are very sharp, I would consider these performance rails, which is again trying to give you a little stability and trying to actually channel the foot into the middle. The edges of the midsole, or the tooling of the midsole, are very flat. There's almost no channeling at all in the edges of the midsole in this shoe. There is this groove that you see here, but remember, this shoe comes from the Adidas Evo 1, which is a plated race shoe, or the rods in Adi Zero. So the Evo 1 was actually two pieces of foam with the rods in between. This is just one piece of foam that has the same aesthetics as the Evo 1. So this is just one big chunk of foam and this very flat tooling of the midsole, which was needed for the way the Evo 1 was constructed. In this shoe, it's just cosmetic, so it really doesn't do anything. But the net effect of this very flat edges of the midsole and really no tooling in the shoe is that when you compress this foam, since it's not channeling the energy anywhere, this shoe just wants to kind of go wherever it wants to go, or it's going to follow whatever direction of motion you are actually running in the shoe. So if you're supinating, you're running on the outside of your foot, it's going to want to roll over. And if you're pronating, you're pushing inward on your foot, it's going to want to cave over because there's really no structure to this. And as far as the sidewalls, or what I call the bathtub, the foam that comes up around the foot, there really is none. So you're definitely running on the foam of the shoe, this big chunk of foam, and all of that together makes this still a very neutral shoe because it is fairly flexible, but it's very wobbly because it's a dynamic foam that doesn't have a lot of tooling in the midsole, doesn't have any sort of sidewalling or bathtub around the heel or the midfoot, and it's just a very dynamic foam that can be a handful. This is probably one of the most unstable shoes of 2025. Staying in neutral but wobbly, let's go to the Nike Vomero Plus. I think this is another shoe a lot of people will call very wobbly, but the reasons as to why this one is so wobbly are very different coming from the Adidas Evo SL. If we look at the rails of this shoe, I would actually say these are softer rails. There's a little rounding to the rails of this shoe. So that initial strike in this shoe isn't quite as aggressive to push you forward into the midfoot. This just allows your foot to roll a little bit more because there's softer rails in this shoe. The tooling on the midsole, though, there's much more. All of these sort of channeling and tooling that you see here are not just cosmetics. They're there to actually control the compression of this foam, let it compress in a very channeled and specific way, and then decompress moving out. I think a really good example of what I'm talking about here is this. If you look at these water bottles, I think anyone could look at any of these bottles and understand that each of these bottles is going to crush very differently. And that's because of the channeling in the edges of the water bottle. What I'm talking about with the midsole tooling is very much the same thing, and you see that very extreme and very clear in this, the Nike Vomero Plus. And I think the biggest thing that brings stability into this shoe, even though this is a big stack of a very dynamic foam, is the sidewalls or the bathtub around the actual bottom of the foot on top of the insole. The place your foot actually sits in the shoe is probably close to the top of this Zoom X logo. This shoe looks like it has a lot more foam in it than it actually does because majority of this foam that you see above the Zoom X logo is actually wrapping around the bottom of your foot in the shoe. So it's giving you a lot of material that's holding the heel down and creating what I call, again, a big bucket seat back here to bring some stability into the shoe. But because this shoe is such a tall stack of such a dynamic foam, this shoe definitely is that neutral wobbly category. But as far as a wobbly shoe goes, this is the kind of shoe that I actually do want to reach for quite often because I want the wobbliness. Again, I want to train that strength in my foot, my ankle, and my lower leg, and especially in my foot because I want to build the stability in my own body and not have to depend on a shoe to give me all the stability. That allows me to run in a much larger range of shoes, and I really value that as a runner. And now, staying in neutral, but now moving to Tippy, let's talk about the ASICS Metaspeed Sky Tokyo, or just the Metaspeeds in general from ASICS. The Metaspeeds, especially last year's Paris series, have always been known as very tippy shoes. And you can begin to see some of the differences here. So if we look at the tooling of the midsole, you can see that they're both very flat. If you look at the contact patch and the width of the shoes themselves, especially the Paris series, you can see how extremely narrow it is. And if we look at the heel, again, you can see how tall these shoes are, but also how narrow. Now, this I think is a really good example of the engineering difference between the Metaspeed Tokyo series and the Metaspeed Paris series. These are both the Sky editions of these shoes, but look how much less of the forefoot you can see in the Metaspeed Sky Tokyo than you can see in the Paris. That shows you just how narrow and how tall the Paris series was in comparison to all the material they added back into the Tokyo series. However, the Tokyo series is still a fairly tippy shoe. And it's a tippy shoe because it still is a very tall shoe that still has a very narrow footprint that you're definitely sitting up on. So the rails of this shoe, while they're very performance oriented, they're very sharp. Again, trying to channel your foot into the middle of the shoe. The tooling on the midsole is very flat. There's really no tooling in this. So this does allow your foot to compress this foam, and then the foam's kind of move around wherever it wants. Now this is a plated shoe, so it's a little bit different from the trainers I've been going through primarily in this video. The plate does bring some stability into the shoe, but it also makes the loading of this foam, especially this lower section of foam, even more apparent. So this shoe can feel very tippy, very unstable. Again, because it's tall, it's narrow, and there's no sidewall or bathtub in this. You're sitting right up on that platform, so you always feel like you're up high on a shoe, and on uneven pavement or a cambered road, this shoe definitely wants to kind of tip one way or another. Now, a tippy shoe is something, if you do have developed strong feet, strong ankles, and strong lower legs, you can work around it. But if you do not have any of that, a tippy shoe is something that could be actually quite dangerous, because this is the type of shoe that's really easy to roll an ankle in. Now, most super shoes are very neutral. I wouldn't call them all tippy, but they're definitely the taller ones, the ones that are really pushing the boundaries of the stack height, but trying to give you a very nimble, very neutral, very narrow package. All of those are going to be somewhat tippy, but I think the Metaspeeds, especially the Paris and Tokyo series, are probably the most tippy options you can find out there. Moving to stable neutral, the reason I use the ASICS Nova Blast 5 as the example to walk through the design and engineering details that brands use to engineer stability into shoes is that I think the Nova Blast 5 is one of the most stable neutral shoes you can buy in 2025. And it's kind of crazy to think about that, because the Nova Blast, especially the Nova Blast 1 and 2, were the opposite of that. They were very neutral, very wobbly, almost tippy, because they were so resilient and kind of narrow actually for the time. But the Nova Blast has come a long way, and I think now in 2025, this is actually quite a stable neutral shoe. Again, hard rails, or the edges of the outsole, are very squared off. Again, channeling your energy into the middle of the outsole. Lots of tooling on the midsole that's going to channel the compression of it, allow it to actually channel it where it needs to go. And a nice sidewall or bathtub around to structure around the heel and midfoot to give stability to the shoe. Again, one of the best stable neutral trainers that you can buy right now. Another great example of a stable neutral shoe is this, the Utreyu Daily Trainer 2. This is a very soft and compressive dynamic foam in a very low stack shoe that is very flexible. So it's a very neutral shoe at its heart. However, because some of the design and engineering of this shoe that's built into it, it brings in that level of stability which you need to make this shoe a true stable neutral shoe. Again, if we look at the rails of this shoe or the edges of the outsole, very squared off. So that's going to center your foot immediately on impact. You can see the outriggers in the midsole. There's a lot of foam that's going past the edges of the foot on both the lateral and medial side. Again, really stabilizing the foot, and that carries all the way through into the heel. So it carries through the midfoot in this shoe especially, and you can see how wide the midfoot is actually in this shoe. And then you can see that even though this looks like it has very untooled edges to the midsole, this channeling and this sort of tiered effect that you have where there's one layer, then a second layer, actually is really controlling how this foam compresses and absorbs that energy and pushes you forward. Again, really great engineering. And there is even a tiny bit of a sidewall or bathtub back here in the heel where you're actually sinking down and you're getting some support. So a wonderfully neutral shoe, but it has a lot of inherent stability in it to actually give you a little bit more comfort and take a little bit of the emphasis off a truly neutral shoe. But again, you're still not forcing your foot to flex one way or another. It's a really nice mix of a bunch of things in this shoe. Moving into what I would consider stable neutral but wobbly is this shoe, the A6 Mega Blast. Now this could not be a more different shoe than the Atreyu Daily Trainer I just talked about. There is much more foam in this shoe, but it still is a very, very dynamic foam, but it's not too dynamic. This is not a race foam. This is a very dynamic, very bouncy foam that's developed specifically for training, but there's a lot of details in this shoe that bring stability into this. So if we look at the rails of this shoe or the edges of the outsole, I would actually say these are a little softer. The actual rubber, I would say, was a hard rail, but it's set inward a little bit from the actual midsole foam. And you can see in this detail, there's a little ridge that comes out from the actual edge of the midsole, which I think, again, just makes this feel a little bit softer. The rail in this shoe is just a little bit softer so that it actually absorbs that initial impact just a little bit more. However, you can see how much foam the outriggers on the lateral and the medial side of the shoe that actually extend away from the foot on both sides. So this again gives you more stability, especially in the midfoot. There's actually quite a wide midfoot in this shoe. And then on the tooling of the midsole, you can see there is some basic channeling in here, which again is there to really allow the shoe to compress in a very specific way and then unload in a very specific way. And there is a minor sidewall and a little bit of a bathtub back here in the heel, though it's not as extreme as some other shoes, mainly the Nike Vomero Plus. That is a much more extreme bathtub in the heel. This one actually has a little less, but a lot of the stability that's actually built into this shoe is coming from a slightly less dynamic, a little bit firmer, but still cushioned foam. All of this material that's pushing out past the edges of the foot, the outriggers of the midsole, and then the channeling of the edges of the midsole on this shoe. That's what's bringing the stability into the shoe, though this still is a wobbly shoe because it is a much more dynamic foam and it is a higher stack. But as far as high stack dynamic shoes, this is about as stable as you're actually going to find. And when thinking about a stable neutral but tippy shoe, it actually took me a bit to find one that would fall into that category because I don't think there's a lot of shoes that fall into that category. And the best example I can come up with is this shoe, the Nike Pegasus Premium, because this is a very tall shoe that's very narrow, especially in the midfoot and the heel, that is very structured in the midsole because of all the technology and materials that are in this midsole. So let's break this down. This air zoom unit that's in this shoe actually gives this shoe a lot more structure than you would expect from a Pegasus. I'm not going to say this runs like a plated shoe, but because of this air zoom unit, this shoe does run a lot more structure. There's a lot more inherent stability in this shoe because of this air zoom unit, but it's still extremely tall. And if you are a midfoot striker or heel striker in this shoe, even though there's a lot of medial heel flaring in this shoe, this is just a very tippy shoe. This shoe just always feels like it wants to fall over, especially if you're landing midfoot to heel. As a forefoot striker, I'm not really noticing that. It's a little bit more wobbly for me as a forefoot striker because of all the ZoomX foam and then the air zoom unit itself. But again, tall shoe that's very narrow but does have some structure to it, that's how you get a stable neutral but tippy shoe. Again, there's not a lot of shoes that would fall into this category except for this one, the Nike Pegasus Premium. I hope that was helpful giving some examples of different types of instability in a shoe. Now, as I said a couple times in this video, I actually will seek out a unstable shoe quite often to run in. That's why I'm loving the A6 Mega Blast, or I like the Nike Vomero Plus. Because again, I want to train that stability into my foot, my ankle, my lower leg. I want to build the stability in my body so that I can go run in any shoe and I'm not really bothered by a wobbly or tippy shoe. Wobbly shoes with strong legs and strong feet are really not a problem. Tippy shoes are kind of always going to be tippy, but if you do have really strong ankles, I think you can actually work around that quite a bit. And you're only really going to run into tippy shoes as far as super shoes or true race shoes, though something, again, like the Nike Pegasus Premium is a little bit more tippy. But again, there's not a lot of tippy shoes out there. Most of the instability you're going to run into will be on the wobbly side, and you can definitely train your foot and leg to work with any wobbly shoe, or really any shoe for that matter. If you have any further questions or you want to know if a certain shoe falls into a certain category, let me know in the comments below. Again, another plug for Doctors of Running. If you want to get into the real weeds of this and really understand the biomechanics and get into it from a doctor's point of view, go check out their content. Again, link in the description to their YouTube channel. Definitely recommend that if you're really interested in this stuff. Thank you for making it to the end of the video. If you want to support what I do here, check out sagasurunning.com for our merch or click the join button below. If neither one of those options are good for you, leave a comment or a like because it helps this channel continue to grow, which I always appreciate. And with that, I'll catch you in the next one.